Imagine waking up one morning to discover that a third of everyone you've ever known is just gone. Not moved away, not hiding somewhere, but dead, wiped from the face of the earth. And now imagine that this isn't some distant apocalyptic nightmare, but reality for millions of people living in the 13th century. Between 1206 and 1368, one man and his descendants carved out the largest contiguous land empire the world has ever seen, an empire so vast that if you stood at its western edge in Eastern Europe and started walking east, you wouldn't reach the Pacific Ocean for over 6,000 miles. This wasn't just conquest, this was reorganization of the entire known world. The Mongol invasions changed everything: trade routes, technologies, religions, diseases, and the genetic makeup of entire continents. And it all started with one boy named Temüjin who had absolutely nothing, who would become the man we know as Genghis Khan. So buckle up, because today we're diving deep into one of history's most brutal, fascinating, and world-altering events, the Mongol invasions. Let's rewind to around 1162, somewhere on the steppes of Mongolia. This is a harsh, unforgiving landscape, endless grasslands that stretch to the horizon, bitterly cold winters where temperatures plummet to 40 below zero, and scorching summers that bake the earth. The people living here are nomadic pastoralists. They don't build cities or farmland. They move with their herds of horses, sheep, and goats, living in portable felt tents called jurs or yurts. Life is hard, resources are scarce, and survival depends on your tribe. Into this world, a boy is born to a minor chieftain named Yesujay and his wife Holun. According to legend, the baby was born clutching a blood clot in his fist, which the shamans interpreted as a sign that he would become a great warrior. They named him Temüjin, after a Tatar chieftain his father had just captured. Now, you might think being the son of a chieftain would give you a pretty good start in life, but the Mongolian steppes don't work that way. When Temüjin was about 9 years old, his father arranged a marriage alliance with another tribe and left the boy with his future in-laws as was customary. On his way back home, Yesujay stopped to share a meal with some Tatars, who recognized him as an old enemy and poisoned him. Just like that, Temüjin's father was dead. When the news reached their tribe, everything fell apart. Without a strong leader, Temüjin's clan abandoned his family, leaving Holun and her children to fend for themselves. We're talking about a widow with 7 young children, including Temüjin, left to survive in one of the harshest environments on earth, with no protection and no resources. The next few years were absolutely brutal. Holun and her children lived off the land, digging for roots, catching fish, hunting small animals, basically scraping by on whatever they could find. They were outcasts, the lowest of the low in a society that valued strength and tribal connections above all else. But this period of hardship forged something in Temüjin. He learned that the traditional tribal system had failed him, that loyalty based on blood ties alone wasn't enough. He also learned to be ruthless. When his older half, brother Begtar, kept stealing food from him and his full brothers, Temüjin and his brother Kosar tracked Begtar down and killed him. He was maybe 13 years old at the time. His mother was horrified, but Temüjin had learned a critical lesson in this world. You take what you need to survive, and you eliminate threats before they eliminate you. As Temüjin grew older, his reputation began to grow. He was captured by a rival clan and put in a wooden collar, essentially enslaved, but he managed to escape with the help of a sympathetic guard. He reunited with his childhood friend Jamaka, and together they started building a following. Here's where things get interesting. Temüjin had a gift that went beyond just being a fierce warrior. He understood people. He knew how to inspire loyalty in ways that broke with Mongolian tradition. Typically, tribal leaders commanded loyalty based on aristocratic bloodlines and clan ties, but Temüjin started promoting people based on merit and loyalty rather than birth. If you proved yourself capable and faithful to him, he would elevate you, even if you were from a humble background. This was revolutionary. He was building a new kind of social structure, one based on what you could do rather than who your father was. But it wasn't smooth sailing. Temüjin's wife Bort was kidnapped by the Merkits, a rival tribe seeking revenge for an old grievance. Temüjin was devastated. He called on his sworn brother Jamaka and another powerful ally, Togrul Khan, and together they launched a surprise attack on the Merkits. They slaughtered the tribe and rescued Bort, though she was already pregnant. The child, Jochai, would later become a source of whispers and doubt about his true parentage, a fact that would cause problems for decades. Still, Temüjin claimed Jochai as his firstborn son and never wavered on this publicly. Over the next 2 decades, Temüjin methodically conquered or allied with every tribe on the Mongolian plateau. His friendship with Jamaka eventually dissolved into rivalry, and the two became bitter enemies. They fought several battles, with victory swinging back and forth. But Temüjin's philosophy of merit-based loyalty kept winning him followers from defeated tribes. Instead of just killing or enslaving conquered peoples, he incorporated them into his growing army, giving them a stake in his success. When enemies betrayed their own leaders to join him, he often executed them for their disloyalty, even though it benefited him, because he valued loyalty above all. But when warriors remained faithful to their defeated lords, he honored them and sometimes recruited them. This created a culture where betraying Temüjin was unthinkable because everyone knew his values. By 1206, Temüjin had done the impossible. He had united all the nomadic tribes of Mongolia under his rule, something no one had ever accomplished. The tribal leaders gathered at the headwaters of the Onon River for a great Kurultai, or assembly, where they proclaimed him Genghis Khan, which roughly translates to universal ruler or oceanic ruler. He was probably in his 40s at this point, and he had taken a fractured collection of warring tribes and forged them into a single nation. But Genghis Khan wasn't interested in just ruling Mongolia. The steppes couldn't support a large, unified population. To keep his new nation together, he needed to expand, to conquer, to acquire wealth and resources. And so began one of the most devastating military campaigns in human history. Let's talk about what made the Mongol army so terrifyingly effective. First, there's the obvious. They were phenomenal horsemen. Every Mongol warrior grew up in the saddle. They could shoot arrows accurately while riding at full gallop. They could sleep on horseback. They could even drink from their horses' veins when water was scarce. Each warrior typically had 4 or 5 horses, allowing them to cover vast distances without tiring their mounts. The Mongols could travel up to 60 miles in a single day, which was unheard of for medieval armies. This mobility was their greatest weapon. They could appear seemingly out of nowhere, strike with overwhelming force, and vanish before the enemy could mount an effective response. But it wasn't just about horses. Genghis Khan revolutionized military organization. He created a decimal system where units were organized into groups of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000. The 10,000-man unit, called a tumen, became the standard Mongol army division. This organizational structure was efficient and scalable. Everyone knew their place, orders could be transmitted quickly, and battlefield tactics could be executed with precision. The Mongols also pioneered psychological warfare. They cultivated a reputation for utter ruthlessness. Cities that surrendered immediately were often spared and treated relatively well. Cities that resisted were completely annihilated, their populations massacred, their buildings razed, sometimes even their fields salted so nothing could grow. This wasn't mindless cruelty, it was calculated terror. Word spread quickly that resistance was futile and costly. So many cities chose to surrender rather than face destruction. The Mongols were also remarkably adaptable. When they encountered enemies with superior defensive technology, they learned and adapted. They recruited Chinese and Persian engineers who taught them siege warfare. They incorporated enemy tactics that worked well. They were constantly innovating, improving their strategies based on what they encountered. This made them incredibly difficult to defend against because they learned from every battle. Genghis Khan's first major target outside Mongolia was the Jin Dynasty in northern China. This was a bold move. The Jin were one of the most powerful states in the world, with massive armies, fortified cities, and sophisticated military technology. But they were also complacent, convinced that these nomadic barbarians from the north couldn't possibly threaten their civilization. They were very, very wrong. The Mongols invaded in 1211, and what followed was a masterclass in military strategy. Instead of attacking the strongest fortresses head-on, Genghis Khan bypassed them, striking into the countryside, destroying crops, disrupting supply lines, and isolating the cities. When he did lay siege to cities, he used the psychological warfare tactics I mentioned earlier. Some cities were given the choice to surrender or die, and when they chose to resist, the Mongols made examples of them. The siege tactics were brutal and effective. The Mongols would sometimes force captured civilians to march at the front of their army, creating a human shield that made defenders reluctant to shoot. They used sophisticated siege engines built by Chinese engineers who had defected or been captured. They diverted rivers to flood cities or cut off water supplies, and they were patient. If a siege took months, so be it. They had time. By 1215, the Mongols had captured the Jin capital of Zhongdu, which later became modern-day Beijing. The city was thoroughly plundered, and thousands were killed. The Jin dynasty was severely weakened, though it would take another 2 decades to completely conquer them. While consolidating control in northern China, Genghis Khan turned his attention westward. This is where things get really interesting. In Central Asia, there was a powerful empire called the Khwers, Mid-Empire, which controlled much of modern-day Iran, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and parts of Afghanistan and Pakistan. It was wealthy, sophisticated, and ruled by a Shah named Ala ad-Din Muhammad. Genghis Khan initially sought trade relations with the Khwarezmids. He sent a trade caravan with valuable goods and ambassadors to establish peaceful commercial ties. But the governor of the border city of Otrar, a man named Inalchuq, accused the caravan of being spies and had them executed and their goods confiscated. This was an enormous mistake. Genghis Khan sent another delegation demanding that the Shah execute Inalchuq and compensate for the losses. The Shah not only refused, he had the head ambassador killed and sent the others back with their beards shaved, which was a grave insult in Mongol culture. Genghis Khan was furious. He had offered peace and trade, and he had been answered with treachery and insult. He assembled a massive army. Estimates range from 100,000 to 200,000 troops, and in 1219 he invaded the Khwers Mid-Empire. What followed was one of the most devastating military campaigns in history, and it's worth going into detail because it shows just how sophisticated and ruthless the Mongol war machine had become. The Khwers Mid-Shah had made a critical strategic error. Instead of concentrating his forces to meet the Mongol invasion, he scattered his troops across his empire to defend individual cities. This played right into Genghis Khan's hands. The Mongols used their superior mobility to isolate and destroy these dispersed forces one by one. The campaign started with the cities of Otrar and Khojand. Otrar, the city whose governor had started this whole mess, was besieged for 5 months. When it finally fell, Inalchuq was executed by having molten silver poured into his eyes and ears, a symbolic punishment for his greed and treachery. The city's population was massacred or enslaved, but the real shock came at Bukhara and Samarkand. two of the greatest cities of the Islamic world, centers of learning, culture, and trade. The Mongols reached Bukhara in February 1220. The city's garrison fled before the main assault, and the city surrendered. Genghis Khan rode into the main mosque and declared, "I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." Whether he actually said these words is debated, but the sentiment captures the Mongol approach. The city was looted and thousands were killed or enslaved. The famous library, containing countless irreplaceable manuscripts, was destroyed. Samarkand fell shortly after. The city's garrison of about 50 soldiers tried to mount a defense, but they were overwhelmed. When the Mongols took the city, they divided the population into different categories. Artisans and craftspeople who had useful skills were spared and sent back to Mongolia. Young women and children were enslaved. Adult men and those deemed useless were killed. Estimates suggest that tens of thousands died in the taking of Samarkand. The great cities of Central Asia were shattered. Libraries burned, irrigation systems destroyed, populations decimated. Some regions would take centuries to recover if they ever fully did. The Shah fled from city to city, unable to rally an effective defense. He eventually died of pneumonia on an island in the Caspian Sea, broken and defeated. His son Jalal ad-Din mounted a more effective resistance, but even he was ultimately driven into exile. The Khwers, mid-empire, which had been one of the most powerful states in the world, was completely annihilated in less than 2 years. This campaign had enormous consequences. It opened up the western routes to Mongol expansion, and it sent shockwaves throughout the Islamic world and Europe. Refugees fleeing the Mongol advance carried terrifying stories of an unstoppable horde from the east. These stories would soon prove all too true. Genghis Khan sent 2 of his most capable generals, Jib and Subutai, on a reconnaissance mission westward. This turned into one of the most remarkable military expeditions in history. With only about 20 men, these 2 generals swept through the Caucasus, defeating multiple armies, and then pushed north into the steppes of Russia. There they encountered the Rus princes and the Cumans, a Turkic people. At the Battle of Kalka River in 1223, the Mongol force faced a much larger coalition army of Rus and Cuman forces. Using a feigned retreat, one of their signature tactics, the Mongols lured the enemy into overextending, then turned and annihilated them. The Rus princes were captured, and according to legend, the Mongols laid them under a wooden platform and crushed them by having a victory feast on top. The message was clear: we can defeat you anywhere, anytime. Back in the east, Genghis Khan continued his campaigns. He invaded the western Xia kingdom, which had been a thorn in his side, refusing to provide troops for his campaigns. During this campaign in 1227, Genghis Khan died. The exact cause of his death is uncertain. Some sources say he fell from his horse. Others suggest he was wounded in battle or died of illness. There are even legends that he was killed by a captive princess. What is certain is that the man who had risen from nothing to conquer much of the known world was gone, but his legacy was just beginning. Before his death, Genghis Khan had divided his empire among his sons. His 3rd son, Ojdai, was chosen as his successor as Great Khan. Now you might think that after the founder's death, the empire would fragment and collapse. This happened to Alexander the Great's empire after all. But the Mongols were different. Genghis Khan had established systems and structures that outlasted him. He had created a legal code called the Asa that governed everything from military discipline to commerce. He had established a meritocracy where competent leaders could rise regardless of birth. He had created an empire based on conquest and expansion, so stopping wasn't really an option. The Mongol invasions were just getting started. Under Ojdai Khan, the Mongol expansion continued with even greater intensity. One of the most devastating campaigns was the invasion of Europe. In 1237, the Mongols, led by Genghis Khan's grandson Batu Khan and the brilliant General Subutai, invaded Rus. This wasn't a small raiding party like the earlier reconnaissance. This was a full-scale invasion with multiple tumens, well over 100,000 warriors. The Russian principalities were disunited, constantly squabbling with each other, and completely unprepared for what was coming. City after city fell. Ryazan was besieged in 1237 and completely destroyed, its population massacred. Vladimir fell in 1238 after a brief siege. The Grand Cathedral, where the remaining population had taken refuge, was burned down with them inside. Kiev, the mother of Rus cities, fell in 1240 after a fierce defense. The city was so thoroughly destroyed that a traveler passing through 6 years later wrote that there were only about 200 houses left standing, and the ground was covered with countless skulls and bones. The Mongols employed the same tactics that had worked so well in Central Asia. Their cavalry was impossibly fast and mobile. They fought in the depths of winter, using frozen rivers as highways, something that European forces found inconceivable. They used psychological warfare and terror to break resistance, and they were utterly ruthless with cities that resisted. But here's something interesting: the Mongols weren't just mindless destroyers. When they conquered cities, they carefully noted what was valuable. Artisans, craftsmen, engineers. These people were spared and often relocated to Mongolia or other parts of the empire where their skills were needed. The Mongols built an extensive intelligence network, using merchants and spies to gather information about their enemies before they even attacked. They knew the political situation, the military capabilities, the strengths and weaknesses of their targets. This was sophisticated statecraft, not just barbarian raiding. After subduing Rus, the Mongols pushed into Eastern Europe. In 1241, 2 major Mongol armies invaded Hungary and Poland simultaneously. This is important to understand. The coordination required to mount 2 separate invasions hundreds of miles apart, each with its own supply lines and objectives, was incredibly sophisticated. The European kingdoms were about to face something they had never encountered before. In Poland, a Mongol force led by Baydar and Kadin swept through the countryside, destroying several smaller armies. At the Battle of Legnica in April 1241, they faced a coalition force led by Duke Henry Roman II of Silesia. The European army included Polish knights, Teutonic knights, and other heavy cavalry, the elite warriors of Christian Europe. They were confident in their superior armor and combat prowess. The Mongols used their classic tactics. They feigned retreat, drawing the heavy European cavalry into a chase. The knights, weighed down by armor and riding slower horses, couldn't catch the Mongol light cavalry. Then, when the Europeans were strung out and disorganized, the Mongols turned and surrounded them. They used composite bows that could penetrate armor at close range. They used smoke bombs and fire to confuse the enemy. The European force was annihilated. Duke Henry was captured and beheaded. The Mongols cut off ears from the dead to count casualties, reportedly filling 9 sacks. This was an absolute disaster for Christian Europe. Meanwhile, in Hungary, the main Mongol army under Batu Khan and Subutai faced King Bela Roman IV and the Hungarian forces. At the Battle of Mohyj in April 1241, the Mongols demonstrated why they were considered the greatest military force of their time. The Hungarians had camped by a river, and Subutai set up a brilliant tactical trap. The Mongols attacked from multiple directions, but crucially, they left one side of the Hungarian camp seemingly open. When the panic set in, the Hungarian forces fled through this gap, thinking they were escaping. But this was exactly what the Mongols wanted. As the enemy fled in disorder, Mongol cavalry hunted them down over miles and miles, turning retreat into slaughter. Estimates suggest that 40,000 to 60,000 Hungarians died in the battle and subsequent pursuit. King Bela barely escaped with his life. Europe was in panic. The Mongols seemed unstoppable. They had defeated every army sent against them. They were now poised to invade Austria, Germany, and perhaps push all the way to the Atlantic. Chronicles from the time describe apocalyptic fears. People believed this was divine punishment, the end times. And then, suddenly, the Mongols withdrew. In late 1241, news reached the Mongol armies that Great Khan Ojdai had died back in Mongolia. According to Mongol tradition, all princes and generals needed to return for the Kurultai to elect the next Great Khan. Batu Khan, who was leading the European campaign, ordered a withdrawal. The Mongol armies pulled back across the steppes, and Western Europe was spared. This is one of those tantalizing what-ifs of history. If Ojdai had lived another 5 years, would the Mongols have conquered all of Europe? Could medieval European kingdoms have stopped them? We'll never know. But what we do know is that Eastern Europe and Rus remained under Mongol domination for centuries. The territory controlled by Batu Khan became known as the Golden Horde, and the Russian principalities paid tribute to it until the late 15th century. This period of Mongol rule, sometimes called the Tatar Yoke, had profound effects on Russian culture, politics, and development. While all this was happening in the West, the Mongols were also expanding in the east and south. Ojdai's successor, his son Gyayak, died after only 2 years. The throne then passed to Mong Khan, a grandson of Genghis Khan, through his youngest son Tolui. Mong was an effective ruler who reinvigorated the empire's expansionist drive. He assigned his brothers to lead major campaigns. Kublai was sent to conquer the Song dynasty in southern China, and Hulagu was sent to conquer the Middle East. Let's talk about Hulagu's campaign because it represents both the peak of Mongol military power and one of the most traumatic events in Islamic history. Hulagu Khan set out westward in 1253 with a massive army. His first target was the Nizari Ismaili state, better known to Europeans as the Assassins. This was a Shia Muslim sect that controlled a network of mountain fortresses in Persia. They were famous for their political murders, using highly trained killers to eliminate enemies. For decades, they had been seen as virtually invincible in their mountain strongholds. Hulagu systematically besieged and captured their fortresses one by one. The last Grand Master surrendered in 1256, and the assassins' power was broken forever. This demonstrated that even the most impregnable defenses couldn't stop the Mongols if they decided to take them. But Hulagu's next target was far more significant. In 1258, he marched on Baghdad, the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate and one of the greatest cities in the world. Baghdad had been the center of Islamic learning and culture for 500 years. It was home to the House of Wisdom, libraries containing countless works of science, mathematics, philosophy, and theology. It was a city of perhaps 500,000 to 1 million people, wealthy beyond imagination. The Caliph al-Mustasim believed the Mongols could be negotiated with or that the wider Islamic world would come to his aid. He was wrong on both counts. The Mongols besieged Baghdad in January 1258. They brought massive siege engines and diverted the waters of the Tigris to flood parts of the city's defenses. After 12 days, the city walls were breached. The Caliph surrendered, hoping to spare the city. Instead, what followed was one of the worst massacres in history. The Mongols entered Baghdad and killed indiscriminately. Estimates of the death toll vary wildly from tens of thousands to over 1 million. The truth is probably somewhere between 200 and 800 deaths. The canals ran red with blood, then black with ink from all the manuscripts thrown into the rivers. The House of Wisdom was destroyed, centuries of accumulated knowledge lost forever. The Caliph himself was executed, according to legend, rolled in a carpet and trampled by horses. because Mongol tradition forbade spilling royal blood on the ground. The destruction of Baghdad was a watershed moment. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had existed for over 500 years, was ended. The city that had been the heart of Islamic civilization was reduced to ruins. Some scholars argue that Baghdad and the wider region never fully recovered from this catastrophe, that it marked the end of the Islamic Golden Age. Whether that's entirely true is debated, but there's no question that the psychological and cultural impact was immense. The Mongols had done what no one thought possible. They had destroyed the very center of the Islamic world. Hulagu continued westward, conquering Syria and preparing to invade Egypt. But then came one of the few Mongol defeats. In 1260, at the Battle of Ain Jalut in Palestine, a Mamluk army from Egypt faced the Mongols. The Mamluks were slave soldiers, professional warriors who had taken control of Egypt. They understood Mongol tactics because some of them had fought alongside or against the Mongols before. At Ain Jalut, the Mamluks used the Mongols' own tactics against them, feigning retreat, using superior mobility, and striking when the enemy was vulnerable. The Mongol force, led by a general named Kitbuka, was defeated and Kitbuka was killed. This was psychologically significant. The Mongols were not invincible after all. The Mamluk victory at Ain Jalut effectively stopped the Mongol expansion westward. Hulagu wanted to return and crush the Mamluks, but he faced problems back east. The Golden Horde, the Mongol Khanate in Russia led by descendants of Jochai, had converted to Islam and opposed Hulagu's destruction of Muslim states. Civil war was brewing within the Mongol Empire. The unity that Genghis Khan had forged was beginning to fracture. Different branches of the family controlled different regions, and their interests were diverging. The empire was becoming too large, too diverse, too divided by geography and culture to remain unified. Meanwhile, in China, Kublai Khan was engaged in the long, grinding campaign to conquer the Song dynasty. This took decades. The Song had formidable defenses, sophisticated military technology, including gunpowder weapons, and a massive population. But the Mongols were patient and adaptable. They built a navy to fight the Song on rivers and coastal waters. They recruited Chinese generals and administrators. They learned siege warfare on an unprecedented scale. City by city, province by province, the Mongols conquered southern China. In 1276, the Song capital of Hangzhou surrendered. The last remnants of Song resistance held out at sea until 1279, when the final Song emperor, a young boy, drowned during a naval defeat. Kublai Khan had conquered all of China, becoming the first foreign ruler to do so. Kublai established the Yuan dynasty and made his capital at Khonbalik, modern-day Beijing. He adopted many Chinese governmental practices while maintaining Mongol military supremacy. This synthesis of Mongol and Chinese systems created a unique imperial structure. Kublai tried to further expand his empire, launching invasions of Japan, Java, and Southeast Asia. But these campaigns were largely unsuccessful. The Mongol military machine, so effective on the steppes and land, struggled with overseas invasions. 2 invasion attempts on Japan in 1274 and 1281 were both destroyed by typhoons that the Japanese called kamikaze, or divine winds. These failures marked the limit of Mongol expansion in East Asia. By the late 13th century, the Mongol Empire had reached its maximum extent. It stretched from Korea to Hungary, from Siberia to India, covering over 12 million square miles, making it the largest contiguous land empire in human history. But it was no longer truly unified. It had fractured into several khanates. The Yuan dynasty controlled China and Mongolia. The Ilkhanate controlled Persia and the Middle East. The Chagatai Khanate controlled Central Asia. The Golden Horde controlled Russia and the Western steppes. These khanates sometimes cooperated but often fought each other. The dream of universal Mongol rule was fading. So let's step back and assess the impact of the Mongol invasions because the consequences were absolutely enormous and still shape our world today. First, there's the immediate human cost. Estimates vary wildly, but it's likely that somewhere between 30 and 60 million people died as a direct result of the Mongol conquests. This was roughly 10 to 15% of the world's population at the time. Some regions were hit much harder. Central Asia, Persia, and parts of China may have lost half their populations. Cities that had hundreds of thousands of inhabitants were reduced to ruins. Entire civilizations and cultures were nearly wiped out. The scale of destruction was unprecedented, but the Mongols weren't just destroyers. Once they conquered a region, they generally tried to restore order and productivity because they wanted tax revenue. Genghis Khan had established policies of religious tolerance, which was unusual for the time. As long as you paid tribute and submitted to Mongol authority, you could worship however you wanted. Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and practitioners of other faiths all coexisted under Mongol rule. The Mongols themselves practiced shamanism and Tengrism, but they were pragmatic about religion. Several Mongol rulers converted to Islam, Buddhism, or Christianity based on political convenience or genuine belief. The Mongols created the largest free trade zone in history. The Pax Mongolica, or Mongol Peace, allowed merchants to travel safely from Europe to China along what became known as the Silk Road. This explosion of trade brought enormous cultural and technological exchange. Paper and gunpowder technology spread westward from China to the Islamic world and Europe. Persian and Arabic mathematics and astronomy spread eastward. New crops, technologies, and ideas flowed along these trade routes in unprecedented volume. Marco Polo's famous journey to China was only possible because of Mongol rule. The Mongols also established an incredibly efficient postal system called the Yam. Stations were set up along major routes where messengers could get fresh horses and supplies. This system allowed messages to travel vast distances remarkably quickly. Merchants and diplomats used this system too, facilitating communication across the empire. This infrastructure enabled the integration of diverse regions into a functioning economic system. But there's a darker side to this trade connectivity. Diseases also traveled along these routes. Many historians believe that the Black Death, the bubonic plague that killed a third to half of Europe's population in the 14th century, spread westward from Central Asia along trade routes protected by Mongol rule. There are accounts of the Mongols using biological warfare, catapulting plague-infected corpses into besieged cities. Whether this actually spread the plague is debated, but it shows the Mongols were willing to use any means necessary. The disease reached Europe in 1347 and caused arguably the greatest catastrophe in European history. In a grim irony, the peace and trade facilitated by the Mongols may have enabled the spread of the pandemic that killed millions. The Mongol invasions also had profound political effects. In Russia, Mongol domination lasting over 2 centuries shaped the development of the Russian state. The princes of Moscow rose to power partly by serving as tax collectors for the Mongols. When the Golden Horde weakened, these princes positioned themselves to create a centralized Russian state. Some historians argue that Russian autocracy and centralized power owes something to this period of Mongol rule. In the Middle East, the destruction of Baghdad shifted the center of Islamic power. The Mamluks in Egypt became the dominant Muslim power, and later the Ottoman Turks would rise to create a new Islamic empire. In China, the Yuan dynasty's rule as foreign conquerors created tensions that would eventually lead to the Ming dynasty restoration of native Chinese rule in 1368. The Mongol Empire's fragmentation in the 14th century led to a period of instability. The different khanates fought civil wars. The Black Death devastated populations across Eurasia. Economic networks disrupted by plague and warfare began to break down, but the impact of the Mongol period endured. The maps of Eurasia had been redrawn. Trade networks, even if disrupted, had been established and would revive. Technologies and ideas had been disseminated across vast regions. The world had become more connected, for better and worse. One lasting impact was genetic. A 2003 study found that about 8% of men in the former Mongol Empire carry a Y chromosome lineage that dates back to roughly 1,000 years ago. This suggests that someone from that period, quite possibly Genghis Khan himself or his close male relatives, has approximately 16 million male descendants alive today. This makes biological sense. Genghis Khan and his sons and grandsons ruled vast territories and had many wives and concubines. Power throughout history has often translated into reproductive success on a massive scale. There's also a cultural legacy. In Mongolia, Genghis Khan is a national hero, the founder of the nation, celebrated on currency, in monuments, and in national identity. In former Soviet states, Iran, and parts of the Islamic world, he's often viewed more negatively as a destroyer of civilizations. In China, the legacy is complex. He's seen as both a foreign conqueror and as a founder of a dynasty that ruled China. These different perspectives remind us that history is always viewed through cultural lenses. The same man can be hero, villain, or something in between depending on who's telling the story. So what lessons can we draw from the Mongol invasions? First, there's the power of organization and discipline. The Mongols weren't successful because they outnumbered their enemies. They often didn't. They won because they were better organized, better led, more adaptable, and more committed to their cause. Genghis Khan's meritocratic system created a military machine where talent rose to the top. His brutal pragmatism, rewarding loyalty and punishing betrayal consistently, created fierce dedication among his followers. Second, there's the double-edged sword of connectivity. The Mongols created unprecedented links between distant regions, enabling trade, cultural exchange, and technological diffusion on a scale never seen before. But this connectivity also enabled the spread of plague and facilitated cultural destruction. Our modern globalized world faces similar tensions. The benefits of